morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? I can't change my accent. I'm from Switzerland. I moved here too late in my life to be able to pick up the local accent. It's actually one of the fascinating things about human language that you can't really fake it after you're a teenager. The FBI, apparently the CIA knows if you haven't been a teenager somewhere, you can never pretend to be from there. How weird is that? Language is a human-specific communication system that evolves to be difficult to understand. It's signaling of in and out groups. We'll talk about that a little more. So anthropogeny, as Dr. de Barros pointed out, unlike anthropology, which is the study of everything human, including the arrangement of seats and architecture and when you come in and whether you have coffee or not, or whether you're in a good mood or not, anthropogeny is a much more narrow focus that is obsessed with trying to figure out how come we are such a strange ape, okay? So the problem with studying human origins is when you do science, you'd like to run an experiment, run it again and again, and do stats, and hopefully get results that you can predict, you can check your hypotheses. But studying human origins we're hugely handicapped because it happened exactly once. There is no other species on this planet that uses language, that thinks about its origin, that organizes meetings such as this, when one of them will try to share ideas with others via language. We have no evidence for any other linguistic species on the planet. All animals communicate, very often in really fanciful ways, very complicated, using ultrasound, using colors, smells and so forth, but there is no other species that has language. So our problem is, in a sense, rather than being biologists, we are historians. We're trying to look back on a very deep history. Some 200,000 years ago, somewhere in Africa, an upright ape developed full symbolic capacity, started using language, and the rest is history. So how can we study this? We need to look back. We can use history. Written history is super young, 5,000 years max. The oldest writing systems from Mesopotamia are 5,000 years old, which means you cannot use written history to look further back than 5,000 years. That's precious little. You can study language, like linguists do. That gets you about 10,000 years back. Ancient DNA, a completely new field of research that is based on the fact you can get snippets, little pieces of 30 to 50 pieces of nucleotides, of DNA letters, back 300,000 years from fossils. That allows us to look a little bit further. You can use archaeology and find artifacts that date back thousands, sometimes even millions of years. The oldest stone tools are between 2 and 3 million years old. Really, the only solution to try to piece together our history as a species and why we are the way we are is to use a comparative approach, where we use all types of scientific information and talk to people across disciplines, being transdisciplinary. You have paleontologists that talk to zoologists, that talk to psychologists, to climate scientists, and so forth. So anthropogeny is this attempt to weave together the humanities, the biological sciences, engineering, physical and chemical sciences to address this question. What is it about this one species that turned it into this language-capable ape that took over the planet? We know when Darwin and Huxley first correctly guessed that our closest living relatives were African apes. They had never seen African apes. Huxley did, but Darwin didn't. He only saw an orangutan in the London Zoo. They had no fossils, 0 fossils. We now have fossils across Africa. It turns out all the hominin fossils that are older than 2 million years old are only found in Africa. It's only after 2 million years ago that you start finding fossils outside Africa. So there is actually super strong fossil evidence that upright apes have been around Africa for the last 6 million years. Being upright is actually very, very old. If you look at a map of where you find fossils, color-coded by age, the yellow, green, and red colors are the older ones, you see they're only found in Africa. And after 2 million years, you start finding fossils outside Africa, and it's only in the last 15,000 years you find anything human-like in the Americas, which is why the Americas are not even shown on this world map, because people arrived here extremely late, and they were fully modern, like you and me. But there are fossils in Europe and in Asia of things called Homo erectus. which moved out of Africa 2 million years ago. And if you look at this timeline ranging over the last 6 million years, from 6 million years ago to the present, you can see that there are fossils throughout, which is very good news. The bad news is, if you were to put all these fossils together, they would still not fill more than the back of a pickup truck. So yes, we have fossils, which Darwin didn't have. They're very informative, but they're precious little compared to the huge time span. I mean, imagining 6 million years is virtually impossible with our minds. And those of you who have studied history, this is a recent fossil from South Africa, Homo naledi, with a very small cranium, bipedal, found in a cave, and recently dated to just the last 200,000 years. If you look at what you know of history from the earliest writing of the Sumerians to Google, this fits in a tiny sliver of time. So when people think history, they usually think about this. And that little purple thing at the end there, that's the sliver of time we have history for. The kind of history anthropogeny is trying to study is that much deeper time for which we have no writing and for which we rely on comparative approaches to try to understand it. So what is there to explain? This is a map. It's actually an image from outer space made with technology that our ape species has developed, Landsat satellites. And you can see where humans are. Humans are all over the place. And where humans are rich, they can light the sky at night. You see all the cities. You can see places like Japan, where there's a lot of fishing at night, extremely bright. You can see the Nile Valley lit up where people live. Apes, in contrast, our closest living relatives, are still restricted to forested tropical forests around the equator. The African apes, the chimpanzees, bonobos, and gorillas live in Africa. And the 2 Asian ape, and as of last week, the 3 Asian ape species, they actually discovered a new orangutan species, of which there are only 800 individuals in Sumatra. They are restricted to these green dots on Sumatra and Borneo, and they're extremely threatened. In your lifetime, they will almost certainly disappear. If you study the DNA of these animals, what the DNA studies reveal is that 2 of the great apes, bonobos and chimpanzees, are actually more closely related to you and I than they are to any other apes. So if you take one thing away from today's lecture, is next time you hear somebody talk about great apes, please correct them and say, great apes is not a biologically valid concept, because either 2 apes are human-like, like us, or we are ape-like, like all the other apes. So we still use great apes because to us, you look at these 2 faces, the chimp and bonobo, nobody is going to mistake them for a human. I was lucky to spend over 2 years in the field studying chimpanzees, and I have to tell you that there were moments where certain individual chimpanzees reminded me of my human friends. So if you spend enough time with them, you start blurring the line a little bit. So what is it that you compare when you study DNA of organisms? I usually bring some props, which I didn't today. I apologize for my laziness, but I usually like to bring a 1000x model of the genome. So if you take a human egg cell or a human sperm and you blow them up 1000x, it would be about the size of an ostrich size for the ovum, and the sperm would be about this big. The total DNA that each one of these sex cell carries is about 1,000 yards long, because the DNA in your cells is 2 times 1 meter of total DNA. So if you multiply that by 1,000, it's about 1 kilometer. And that's to give you an idea that when people study DNA, it's a lot to study. It's a huge amount of DNA that you can compare. And then you can do the following exercise. You can ask, well, for every piece of DNA that I compare between a human and a chimpanzee, how many differences are there? I'm sure many of you have heard the stat that all humans and chimpanzees differ by about 1.4% of their DNA. That is based on parts of the DNA that are understood. There are genes that encode proteins. It turns out if you count all the chunks of DNA that are in humans but not in chimpanzees, or the other chunks that are in chimpanzees but not in humans, the total difference is about 5% of the total DNA. You might think that's a lot. It's actually very little, because women and men sitting in this room actually differ by about the same amount of DNA. Us guys are lacking an X chromosome. X chromosomes are 150 million base pairs long. That's 5.1% of the genome. So the genetic difference between a man and a woman in our species is about as much as the genetic difference between an average human and an average chimpanzee. I'm not arguing in which direction that we differ. So DNA is actually packaged inside your cells. It's not a big spool of wool like I use with the thread. And the DNA is spooled around proteins to form chromatin, and the only moment you can see chromatin is when a cell divides. Some of you in biology might have seen the skin of an onion, and if a cell is dividing there, you can actually see the chromosomes. They're named color bodies, chromosome in Greek, because if you throw color at the skin of an onion, those cells that are dividing will show you these little colored bodies. And that's chunks of DNA that are in the process of dividing. That's how chromatin looks, like pearls, beads on a pearl. And it turns out if you take the chromosomes, the different chunks of DNA in a chimp cell, in a human cell, they look remarkably the same, except that all the great apes, remember, not a true category, but all the great apes have 48 chromosomes instead of 46 like our species. That's because 2 of the ancestral chromosomes fused in our ancestor, and ever since humans have walked around with 46 chromosomes instead, 2 times 23 chromosomes instead of 2 times 24. This is what you can now do when you study chromosomes. 50 years ago, when you studied chromosomes, you would throw chemical dyes at them and they would give you banding patterns based on the composition of the DNA. Now you can throw DNA at chromosomes and fluorescently tag it. You can paint chromosome to discover different areas that have different genes in them. The big, beautiful sphere up there is a cell that's busy living and doing its stuff. In a cell that's busy doing stuff and not dividing, the chromosomes are actually puffed up, like the thread I use as a model. But when the cell is dividing, the chromosomes line up beautifully and condense and make these colored bodies that you can stain. And if you stain the chromosomes of humans, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, and macaques, with the same probes, you can actually see how remarkably similar they are. You can see as you go away from human, the colors change a little bit more. And the second chromosome there, marked with 2 in white, humans is a single chromosome, and all the other non-human primates are 2 chromosomes, which fuse. So it actually tells you that there's 2 chromosomes in the apes that when you fuse them look remarkably like our chromosome. You can use changes in chromosomes to retrieve what happened in the history of our genome. How did the packaging of our DNA directly, it tells you directly who is more related to whom, based on which changes happened. And from this you retrieve as well that 2 species of apes, the chimpanzees and bonobos, are more similar to us than to any other apes. Now, when people study DNA, it's very important to keep in mind that the history of life is like a big river, and DNA flows from one generation to the next. So each little square, open and closed square here is a mating pair, a female and a male. And the lines are the many, many different ways in which DNA can flow from the past up to the present. And when DNA gets separated, we call that speciation. Now, what is very interesting is each one of you sitting here is a unique mosaic of pieces of DNA that has never existed before and will never exist again. If you're lucky and reproduce, you will shuffle the DNA you inherited from your parents, which was already shuffled from your grandparents and shuffled from the ones before, and pass this on into a sperm or an egg, which is a completely new combination of pieces of DNA. And it turns out that within you, 2 pieces of DNA can have 2 completely different histories. One piece of DNA in red shares a common ancestors only about 10 generations back, and another piece of DNA, I would have to go back 20 generations to find the common ancestor. That's one reason why it's so difficult when you do 23andMe or ancestry studies. You're not just directly related to the King of Britain or your favorite royalty. You actually are a mosaic of pieces that come from both famous people and infamous people, and people you would hope never to be in your ancestry. Unfortunately, they are in your ancestry. So if you look at a particular cell here that happens to be male, it has autosomes, these are the chromosomes we all carry, and sex chromosomes. Females have 2 X, and humans have an X and a Y chromosome. The Y chromosome is what turns on a switch and makes you male. It turns out that you inherit most of your DNA from both parents, that they inherited from grandparents, from great-grandparents. But keep in mind that each generation, this is shuffled. So the mosaic that we are sitting here is very small scale. Every couple of thousand letters of your DNA is another chunk that was shuffled. And it turns out you can learn a lot from the shuffling pattern. There's some pieces of DNA that never get shuffled. One is the Y chromosome. It behaves like your last name in the patriarchal societies when your last name is Smith or Müller or Gagneux or de Barros or Wu or Zhang. You name all the children irrespective of whether they're male or female after the father, right? It turns out the Y chromosome is passed only from male to male. The mitochondrial DNA, which is a chunk of DNA that's actually circular and it's in the powerhouse of your cells, a little organelle that burns sugar and makes the energy called ATP, that is inherited only from mother to daughter. The sons get it, but the sons never pass it on. So interestingly, you can use different chunks of DNA to study about the history of the fathers and the fathers' fathers, or the mothers and the mothers' mothers, or the whole population. Now, the bad news is, if we have 2 parents, 4 great-grandparents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, and 16 great-great-grandparents, and the rule of thumb, in my experience, that in 10 people, you're likely to have 1 person that's an asshole. Imagine how many assholes are in your ancestry. So what are apes made of? Are they just DNA in cells? No, they're not. Much of your body is not DNA. It's actually fat and sugars, and there are no genes for those. Testosterone, estrogen. Is there a gene for estrogen? No, it's not a protein. So a lot about life is not directly encoded in a gene. The genes encode proteins, and proteins can make building blocks, but they also make enzymes, and the enzymes can take fats and turn them into steroid hormones. So it turns out that there is a kind of bias towards the easy part of biology, which is very complicated, but it's easy because it's template-driven. We now understand the language of life, which is DNA encoding proteins. But just like when you make a good cake, you don't just use proteins, you use sugars and fats. And sugars and fats are not encoded in your DNA. They code, all the membranes are made out of lipids. And outside the membranes, they're coated with sugar. So this dogma of molecular biology that DNA is translated to RNA, and then RNA makes proteins, is much more complicated because every single cell has 2 spheres of fat, one containing the DNA called the nucleus, and another one containing the cytoplasm where all the stuff happens that a living cell has to do. And all of you consists of hundreds of billions of cells, and these cells talk to each other. How does a cell know what the neighboring cell is doing? It turns out they talk to each other via the blue layer of sugars called glycans. They come in through the diet. And they all these different types of molecules have to work together to allow your development and to make a complex organism with lots of cells. You develop from a fertilized egg. And your development is affected by the temperature, the humidity, but also whether you get infected or not by a parasite. And in the case of apes and humans, by your culture. Who is around you? Is somebody abusing you? Is somebody promoting your development, feeding you properly, hugging you, talking to you? These things are really important in how we develop. Finally, if you want to make the next generation, you have no choice but to find somebody of the opposite sex to reproduce with. So this is 2 bonobos at the San Diego Zoo where I worked for a couple of years, and that's usually what they do if you throw some sugarcane in. They're transmitting their DNA potentially to the next generation. It turns out humans have invented a really important new niche, which has to do with an alternative inheritance system. We transmit DNA just like all other life forms. But because we have culture, we transmit much more than DNA. We transmit knowledge system, behavioral system, belief systems, value systems, and these are transmitted from one generation to the next. Kind of like DNA, but not totally. It's very rapidly evolving. It turns out your grandchild can teach you how to use Facebook. Well, that doesn't happen with DNA. DNA flows from the old to the young. But culture can flow the other way. Teenagers, every generation, come up with some new rad word, And next thing you know, the old people who complain about how teenagers are destroying language, they start using the hip words. They're usually like a generation too late. But still, that's the big difference, one of the many big differences between culture and DNA. And you cannot think about how humans became the way they are without considering the fact that we are steeped in culture. Very often you're not conscious of it. You don't realize, when you first are confronted with, if you came to visit my family, you're from Southern California, every time we meet, we kiss 3 times, irrespective of whether we're guys or girls. You say, ooh, he's kissing his dad 3 times, that's odd. Well, that's cultural. To me, it's second nature. I'm freaked out when I go somewhere here, somebody is eating, and nobody is saying anything. In France and Central Europe, if somebody is eating, you acknowledge that they are eating, and you say, bon appétit, or buen provecho, or buon appetito. Well, I traveled to East Africa recently, regularly, in East Africa, in Swahili culture. If you are eating, you have to acknowledge that somebody walking by is not eating. So if you are drinking chai, there is no way you cannot say, karibu chai, please come have my chai. You're not expecting this foreigner, this stranger to sit down and drink your tea. But it's a cultural thing that you cannot be there drinking your tea and not let the other person know that you have tea and they don't. That's just a small example of the importance of culture, and we're usually not aware of it. It turns out that this inheritance system involves quite a bit of technology. Anthropologists have traveled the world over the last 200 years and documented certain things that you find in every culture, including all the hunter-gatherer cultures. And the hunter-gathering way of life is how we lived for the last 100,000 years. Farming and keeping animals is about 10,000 years old. That's a blip in time compared to over 1,000 years of living as a hunter-gatherer. Hunter-gatherers use shelter, they control fire, they make tools, including hunting traps, they use weapons, they use twining or thread, they use containers, they can be ostrich eggs, my model of a cell. They use fire. Fire was a game changer. There is no other species that has controlled fire, the use of fire. And we don't know how old this is in humans. It almost certainly is one reason why, how many in this room still have their wisdom teeth? Minority. Most of us don't have space for them anymore because our jaw has shrunk almost certainly because we cook our food and we don't have to chew as much. So, how would this have started? What do you see on this image? Anybody? You see something on this image? A footprint, yes, very good. One in the middle. So this is an arrow pointing to a footprint. This is a photograph I took 3 years ago in southern Tanzania when I was visiting people called the Hadzabe, the Hadza people. They're hunter-gatherers. The guy holding the arrow had spent the night in a camp where I also spent the night, and we went out in the morning to hunt. And when he saw this foot, he said, hey, Pascal, this is Philemon, his friend, and it looks like he hunted a zebra. Then we arrived in the camp where Philemon lives, and he was there with the zebra he hunted. So based just on the information here, he was capable to infer this is a fellow human. I actually recognize which individual it is. And based on all the zebra footprints up there, and then the cow footprints on the side that came later, and a sandal further up, he pieced together a story. Well, guess what? There is no other species that can do this. This is not the smell. This is reading a sign left by another person or another animal and coming up with a scientific theory of what happened. And because they do it so often, they get really, really good at it. Sometimes they're wrong. But this was an example where they were right. So could it be that something as trivial as you would think, like reading animal tracks, might have been the beginning of becoming symbolic, where you start creating symbols that have meaning? It turns out these symbols are super important because they organize. Once you have writing, of course, you can start using symbols like crazy, but symbolic thought is almost certainly much older than writing. There are these ostrich eggs from southern Africa about 70,000 years ago that have scratches on them. There was ochre that was almost certainly used to put on your body. There are beads that people carried around their necks. Things like names. We do not know of any animals that use names. Well, if you have a name, you can have a reputation. I misbehave, I say something inappropriate here, I'm aware of the fact that about 100 people sitting here can convey that to somebody else. That influences what I say. And that's something that doesn't happen without names, because without names, you can't have two people gossiping about a third person. A lot of non-humans probably would love to be able to do that, but they can't because they don't have names or language. A huge game changer. Names are important too because you can tell a child about kinship, about the group of people that he or she are related to. They might be living in another social group, but you can tell stories about that. You can come up with rituals and dances and music, sacred spaces that have meaning to whatever you believe in. You can signal group identity to other groups, and you can use this to cooperate as groups or to fight against each other. And if you switch to modern times, you would get a picture like that. Group identity is fantastic, but it's less fantastic when it's used to denigrate and fight against other groups. Names are fantastic. It turns out neuroscientists have shown if you show us a picture of a homeless person, we tend to kind of dehumanize them because we don't want to empathize too much because it's trouble. You show a symbol of Apple, it's a corporation, and people light up areas in the brain that think about humans. So we give some corporations the status of a fellow human being, and we give some fellow human being the status of something that is disturbing that I'd rather not be confronted with. So these things are really, really important aspects of the human mind. I have a lot of colleagues who are evolutionary biologists, and when I tell them, I'm interested in anthropogeny, what made humans the way we are, they say, come on, relax already, Pascal. We're just another ape. We have a few more tricks up our sleeves, but there's nothing to explain. And I think there is something to explain. This is a summary of human behavior, mostly by people who have the means, who are rich and can buy an airline ticket. This is 1 day's worth of international jet flights on our planet. Meanwhile, our closest living relatives, chimpanzees, live in groups up to about 100 individuals. The males never leave the group in which they were born. If they do so, they risk their life. Because if they encounter other males from the neighboring group, they will almost certainly be murdered by these other males. Male chimpanzees are incredibly xenophobic. They have zero tolerance for males that they don't know that come into their territory. So these are 4 males patrolling the territory in Central Africa. And when they do that, they specifically look for trespassers. If the trespasser is a young female that is fertile, she's okay. She might come in. But if the trespasser is a male, they kill him. So one thought experiment is, what would happen if you take a jet and you pack it with 300 unrelated male chimpanzees and you fly them from LA to Zurich? How many do you think are still alive? I stopped photoshopping. I figured, there's one bully that is preventing all the other apes from coming into the plane. But no, it would be a disaster because they are not known for having tolerance. So next time you're in a flight and you see somebody with flight rage, you should still marvel at the fact that most of the flights actually arrive and nobody gets injured and they don't have to land somewhere catastrophically because 2 people are at each other's throats. So as I mentioned, there is now full genome data that clearly proves that we are more closely related to 2 of the apes than the others. And I also mentioned that we can now get DNA out of fossils, and this is already outdated, but these are the increasing number of extinct animals for which we now have genetic information. Things like elephant birds and moas and woolly mammoths and Colombian mammoths. It's really exciting. The problem is, imagine a piece of bone that's in the ground for tens of thousands of years or hundreds of thousands of years. Most of the DNA in that sample will be bacterial or fungal from the stuff in the ground. And then there's a lot of DNA that's actually from the hands of the person who found the sample. You have to throw all this out. And you have to sift through your data to find the little chunks of DNA that actually come from the fossil that you want to study. The good news is this has been done, and it has been done for 2 extinct humans. One of them is Neanderthal, named after a valley, the Neander Valley in Germany. And the other one is a Denisovan, which is named after a tiny little pinky bone from a cave in Siberia. This is the irony. We used to have no fossils in Darwin's time when he correctly guessed that we must be an African ape. Then we started finding fossils, but we had no DNA. We only had DNA from living people. But then ancient DNA started discovering, reading old DNA, And now we have the complete DNA of certain life forms related to us, extinct hominins, but we only have a pinky bone to piece together what their biology looked like. There's actually good news. Some areas in northern China have fossils of skulls and a postcranial skeleton that are likely to be Denisovans, but people are working on the ancient DNA. The take-home message is that as modern humans came out of Africa in the last 70,000 years, they bumped into Neanderthals and Denisovans, and some of us picked up some ancient DNA. So this is a cartoon version of this. From what we know, based on modern DNA and ancient DNA and fossil record, our species evolved in Africa in the last 100,000 years, left Africa 70,000 years ago, bumped into Neanderthals and Denisovans, and picked up little pieces of DNA. The only living humans who have Denisovan DNA are now found in Papua New Guinea and Australia. Nobody else on the planet has been found to have Denisovan DNA. And interestingly, in Africa, even though Africans have more genetic diversity than the entire planet combined, they do not have any evidence for Neanderthal DNA. But there is some inklings that there were some other archaic human forms that some Africans got some DNA from. So the plot is getting really complicated. But remember those chromosomes I showed you, which are here arranged in a circle. So 23 chromosomes in a circle. And what this study did, it asked, well, if there is Neanderthal DNA or Denisovan DNA in blue here on our chromosome, where are these pieces of DNA? And it turns out, mostly, the only Neanderthal DNA that your genome can tolerate is somewhere where there are no important genes. These areas are called gene deserts. They are highlighted in blue and red in the central two circles. Some of you might have heard about FOXP2. FOXP2 is a protein that's very important in orchestrating the expression of other genes. And it's really important in the production of language and the timing of how you move. It's important for balance, for speech production, and for the perception of speech. FOXP2 is a highly conserved gene that has changed only recently in humans. That's in a gene desert as well. No influx from the Neanderthals was tolerated there. But there's a couple of nuggets of DNA that some of us got from these extinct species that actually seem to be useful. And these are a few examples. The most famous one is a gene called EPAS1. The only people who carry this gene in modern living humans are Sherpas and Tibetans. And Tibetans and Sherpas are famous because mothers can have a baby that has a perfect normal birth rate at 5,000 meters of altitude. There are no mountains this high anywhere in the Americas. You have to go to the Himalayas. That's really important because it means that over the last maximum 70,000 years after modern humans arrived in the Tibetan plateau, a subgroup of them that had interbred with the Denisovans recruited this EPAS1 gene from the Denisovans to make it possible to have normal birth weight babies. A few other examples include things like skin pigmentation and lipid metabolism and resistance to certain diseases. So the puzzling thing is, we know that until fairly recently, there were Denisovans here indicated by a pinky bone and a tooth. There were Neanderthals for which we have actually more than a pickup truck's worth of bones. And there was a very peculiar Homo erectus-like species, Homo floresiensis, the hobbit from the island of Flores in Indonesia, that only went extinct 30,000 years ago. But we're the last ones standing. We met some of these extinct hominids, we exchanged a little bit of DNA, but everywhere we went, they stopped existing. So you can have it, some people don't react well when I say, well, humans are just so unusual. They say, no, you're just in love with our species because you're one of them and you're biased. There's nothing special about humans. So I try to turn it around. I say, I'm not trying to explain how awesome we are or fantastic or beautiful or smart. I'm trying to explain why we are so nasty. Everywhere we go, many things go extinct and we don't tolerate other human forms. There are 2 species of chimpanzees, there are 2 species of gorillas, and there are 3 species of orangutans. But there's only 1 species of humans. Why that is, we don't know. And I think it's an interesting topic to ask questions about. So a few words about, when I talk about genes and the genome, The genome refers to the complete collection of all the DNA in each one of your cells. The textbook idea is that once a sperm and an egg get together, they make a new individual. The sperm and the egg never stop living, right? So life does not start when they get together. A dead sperm will not give you a live human, and a dead egg will not give you a live human as well. So you need a live sperm and a live egg to come together. Meanwhile, 200 million other sperms die miserably, killed by the female immune system, but one survives. You bring together 2 times 23 chromosomes, that's your genome. A locus or a gene is a particular place on there. So if you just landed on one of these strands of DNA, you can go along the DNA and you find, oh, there's one locus, another locus, a third locus, a fourth locus. It's just the Latin word for place. An allele is the same place where you have 2 slightly different things. What you got from dad and mom are a little bit different. So most of you have 2 different alleles for each one of the genes that you get. A haplotype is like beads on a string, different variants that are right next to each other. And of course, a gene, if it's expressing a protein, you can recognize a promoter, which is like the ahem. It tells the machinery of the cell, please come here, start reading the gene, make this protein. You can edit. The RNA can be edited. It's a working copy. So with the same gene, you can make multiple different proteins by leaving out one chapter or repeating a chapter. That becomes then functional, the mRNA, the messenger RNA, that gets transcribed into a protein. So it's just a few key terms. It turns out it's extremely complicated. So I was trying to look for a good way to convey how complicated the genome is. This is an art installation by Spencer Tunick. He does these naked flash mobs. It's the Gran Plaza in Mexico City. 20,000 people went there and suddenly all undressed. That's your genes. There's about as many genes as there are students at this college. And each one of these players is a protein coding gene. That only explains 2% of all your DNA. If you add all the spaces between the exons, it explains 20% of your DNA. You still have 80% of DNA for which we're not quite sure what it does. Until recently, geneticists called it junk DNA. We now are quite sure it's not junk. It's involved in regulating how genes are expressed. So for every one of these naked students standing on this Grand Plaza, there is thousands of strands of DNA that encode a RNA, but they never make proteins. So they make kind of this working copy that then goes and, as impresario behind the scenes, it kind of massages what the genes do. More than that, there are hundreds of thousands of enhancer. An enhancer is a piece of DNA that can influence a gene somewhere else. So think of the 20,000 some students at Palomar College. Each one of them has roughly 100 friends and family that mind their business. They say, no, don't wear this, you should behave like this, stop doing this, come, why don't you visit me, you should talk to your friend, you should stop talking to that friend. Think of your genome as a micro-society where the protein coding genes, what you learn about in biology, that's the 20,000 students. But what regulates what these 20,000 people do is many more elements throughout the entire DNA. And many of these enhancers can be transcribed. So this is an example of where the same gene, this is a stretch of DNA up there, and you can see there is gene X, and there is a machinery of proteins that can land on the DNA in blue, and that machinery will read the gene. But there is an enhancer A and an enhancer B. If enhancer B is active, enhancer A is active, then you only get expression where the brown color is in the paws of the embryo of the mouse or in the middle of the embryo of a fly. If the other enhancer is active, that same gene is turned on in the brain, in the mouse, or towards the end of the fly. So basic scientists who are trying to understand how gene expression is regulated are starting to unravel how complicated this thing is. Given that you have the same 20,000 gene in every one of your cells, your eye cell will just single-mindedly express, the lens of your eye will express a protein called crystallin. You make crystallin, 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 more crystallin, and then it dies, and it makes a beautiful translucent lens. But a neuron is not even going to express crystallin. A neuron is busy expressing 10,000 different genes, and as I talk to you now, if you think some of the things are interesting or stupid, a neuron will express different sets of genes. So you talking to each other puts you in charge of gene expression in your fellow human, which is a really powerful notion. Our behavior, our social or antisocial behavior, has an impact on gene expression, especially in young children. And that's something that is increasingly realized. So next time you think about this simple, oh, there's a gene that does that and another gene that does that, remember that the way the DNA is wrapped, even that influences gene expression. The histones, the proteins that are wrapping the DNA, they can be chemically modified. That can turn on a gene or shut off a gene. The DNA itself can be modified by a chemical called a methyl group. And if DNA has a methyl group on it, it's shut down. So even though you have the DNA there, it's ready to say something, for whatever reason, that copy is shut off and only the other copy is on. Sometimes both copies, your dad's and your mom's copies, are turned off. Finally, there is an alphabet soup of RNAs that will bend on themselves, make these little structures like loops, and they go and interact with what happens in the cell. They regulate gene expression as well. And there are proteins that are not building blocks. They bind RNA and orchestrate how your genes are expressed. So if you need an example of this type of epigenetic, it's not the DNA sequence, it's actually how the DNA is wrapped and chemically modified. You all know it. It's the queen bee. In a beehive, at a certain point, the worker bees decide we need a new queen. The queen is laying eggs all the time. All these eggs usually become infertile worker bees. If the worker bees decide we need a new queen, they make a special chemical in their glands that they feed to just one egg, and it changes the chemical modification, the epigenetics of this egg, and then out hatches a queen. So that's one of the best understood examples of this is not in the DNA. This information is actually a democratic vote by the worker bees that they need a new queen, and they chemically switch gene expression via the food so that they get a new queen. Well, we switch things as well, and sometimes based on culture. You remember the Y chromosome I told you about that behaves like your family name? It's transmitted from father to son only. So people are now studying the distribution of different types of Y chromosome around the entire world. And you can see how in Africa, in red, you see the African Y chromosomes have the deepest time range. Yet another proof that we are all Africans. Several Y chromosomes that exist in Africa never made it out of Africa. They don't exist outside Africa. They're true and honest marker of African ancestry. And then the further away you go into the Americas, you get a very shallow history. Now, if you compare here on your left, the Y chromosomes, on your right, the mitochondrial DNA. You can look at how much genetic diversity there is on different continents, Africa, Andes, Central Asia, Europe, Near East, Southeast Asia, Siberia, and South Asia, and look at the mitochondrial DNA first. 50,000 years ago, with the out of Africa, huge boom of humans that start taking over the world, there is more and more and more and more diversity of mitochondrial DNA. As you would expect, if the population gets larger, you collect more mutations, you have more diversity. Look at what happened in humans. Same thing, 50,000 years ago, more and more diversity on the Y chromosome. About 8,000 years ago, boom, a huge loss of diversity. It's as if everybody, there was only, most people had suddenly the last name Smith. Everybody with another last name wasn't around anymore. What do you think this is? Anybody has an idea? This is actually the culture of certain males becoming kings and emperors and controlling reproduction and having hundreds and thousands of wives, whereas during our ancestry as hunter-gatherers, we're mostly pair bonding. You never had a male that could have thousands of kids. But with agriculture, you start having empires and kingdoms and very powerful males. And these powerful males took advantage of their power. No excuse for Weinstein, but very much that phenomenon. Powerful males try to monopolize females and have way more kids than all the other males. And you can read this in the DNA. So studying our genomes can actually show you an impact of culture. This is culture molding the DNA of humans. Another example, so it's a second bottleneck, only in the Y chromosome. You don't see that in the whole genome because that gets shuffled, and you don't see it in the mitochondrial DNA. Another example is if you walk from Ethiopia, Addis Ababa, towards the New World until you go over the Bering Bridge down to Tierra del Fuego. As you get further away in thousands of kilometers from Africa, the chunks of DNA that haven't had time to shuffle get longer and longer and longer. That's called runs of homozygosity. But there is an anomaly in the Middle East and all the way over to Malaysia and some places in Central Asia. There is bigger chunks of DNA than you would expect. Something there is causing inbreeding in these populations. That's one way of reading that. Well, if you look at another map and you ask, well, which cultures actually encourage consanguineous marriages, which means uncles marry nieces and first cousins marry, for political and religious reasons, because you keep your money together. This is an example of how mating practices enforced by belief systems that are cultural and inherited are actually reflected in our biology. So next time you have a discussion with someone who says, well, it's very dangerous to try to explain biology, human behavior with biology, you should ask, well, do you think you can explain human biology with human behavior? And that's an example where the flow, it's actually culture that's molding the DNA. It's not the DNA that's forcing you to do something. It's the culture that forces the DNA to do something. So I think, if you agree with me that there is a few things to explain, you could do the following exercise. You can take a book, open the first a dictionary, and just say, all these things are only done by humans. Astronavigations like astronauts, beekeeping, cycling, x-rays, yoga, and ziplining. None of the chimps do any of that. A lot of that has to do with technology, but a lot of it has to do with the symbolic mind that we have. And one key difference is that, yes, non-humans have culture. People around the world have documented that animals can also inherit behavior. The young animals learn something from mom or dad, and then the next generation does the same thing. This is very nicely shown in chimps, but the big difference is they keep doing the same thing. One thing we can do with our minds is we build upon ideas that others have had, and we combine ideas and come up with a new idea. And if that is a hit, everybody copies it. So most of us have just the best copying machines called brains in our heads. We innovate, and we by copying people, we prevent good ideas from going extinct. A couple of colleagues of mine who study primates in the wild and are interested in cultural transmission pointed out that, yes, apes have culture, but they might not know that they have culture. Kind of like this French rich guy in a Molière play that says, you have convinced me that I speak prose, because he didn't know what prose was. So apes seem to be unaware that they have culture. Another very interesting thing to mention Darwin again is that Darwin pointed out that blushing is the most peculiar emotion of humans. Blushing happens to all humans. It's involuntary change in dilation of blood vessels in your face. But if you are melanically challenged, you belong to those human populations that have lost a lot of melanin, it's much easier to detect. But everybody blushes. This is the biggest organ in your body. And it advertises that you are aware of what people are thinking of you or might be thinking of you. No other animal has been detected that blushes. In fact, I have discussions with some chimpanzee researchers, colleagues of mine. They admit, they say, I don't even know how to come up with a situation that would embarrass a chimpanzee. If you only blush when you're embarrassed, it turns out, recently people have asked, could you blush alone? It turns out in the dark. The answer is you can blush in the dark, but you have to be sitting with some other people. If you're alone, you don't blush. So it's this, you recruit your biggest organ to advertise to people without your control that you might actually be preoccupied about what they think of your status or whether you're smart or handsome or cool or whatever. Very, very powerful. And of course, language is this method that exploits our faculties and it weaves together your brains. You all use Facebook, or most of you do, and you know how important on eBay, Facebook, Airbnb your reputation is. Well, we've been doing that for 100,000 years via language, because we can convey information about somebody that is not present. We can also lie and make up stuff and try to destroy their reputation, a very powerful tool that more often than not actually works quite successfully. This allows for this wide mesh of reputation that surrounds all of us. And if you're not aware of your reputation and you truly don't care about your reputation, you won't do particularly well in a society. So if you go back in time, you remember I told you that understanding human origins is this historical enterprise. Over the last million years, there is archaeological evidence for more and more tools. Stone tools starting with big chunky things, hit a couple of times to have an angle you can use to break a big bone. And for about 1 million years, our ancestors made these tools, and then they switched and started making a tear-shaped Acheulean hand axe. Accompanying that, the brain has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. And making a big brain is complicated. How is it done? You'd be surprised that it was only a couple of years ago that for the first time, a Japanese team was able to win the confidence of a pregnant chimpanzee, female, who would let them image the baby growing inside her womb. And what they discovered is, compared to humans in blue, both the total brain volume and the speed at which the brain grows tanks in mid-gestation in the chimpanzees. Our closest living relative kind of stops investing in a brain mid-gestation. In our case, we power through, and after you were born, your brain continues to grow like a fetal brain for the first year of your life, while your mom or other caretakers are singing to you, talking to you, nursing you, and so forth. So the brain is developing with all this cultural input. This came at a huge cost. The human brain has to do a half rotation and a half rotation back to clear the pelvis. That's a huge constraint, yet it continued growing. We switched schedules of life. Humans invented childhood, which is a period where the body doesn't grow particularly much, but the brain is making new connections and developing like crazy. Our brain, just a couple of pounds of weight, uses 20% of your energy. We invented adolescence, where there is a time delay between when we sexually mature and we actually start reproducing. And most importantly, in natural populations of hunter-gatherers, about 20% of the adults are post-reproductive adults. So having old folks around is really, really important for our species. So there's a lot of interest that the altered schedule of life that we observe in humans, long before agriculture, this is true for all the hunter-gatherers that still live, essentially allows more cultural input, potentially more nutritional input where you take time in developing these really expensive tissues. It might be facilitated by stronger pair bonding. It might be facilitated by the fact that in many human societies, it's not just mom that looks after the child. There are aunties and grandma and uncles and older brothers. This derived schedule is one of the things that allows our brains to be the copying machine it is. We imitate. We are incredibly good at imitate. In fact, we over-imitate. Chimpanzees imitate, but it's about the goal. One chimpanzee observes the other chimpanzee getting a nut, also wants the nut, will do everything to get the nut. Human children over-imitate. It's more about how you do it than what you are doing. And that's very true for language as well. So one idea is that this delay in development in humans actually is an adaptation to suck in culture and turn us into this cultural being we are. And all this happens, surprisingly, with crunching the amount of time we can have babies apart. So before farming, hunter-gatherers have a kid about every 3 years. The great apes have a baby, a surviving baby, every 5 years. So we slow down how we develop, but we pump out children more rapidly. And that's almost certainly part of the answer why humans took over the planet. Because we make more babies, they're more costly, but with culture and help of grandmas and aunties, we actually manage to make these kids grow up and become healthy. This is an example of a Hadza grandmother in her 70s lifting a huge rock. And above, you have the age distribution of chimpanzees on the left and humans on the right in hunter-gathering societies. You see how many in purple, how many old, mostly ladies, because mortality is so much higher, but there's a couple of grandpa in the equations as well. It turns out there's some genetic evidence that in humans there is selection for protection against cognitive loss in old people. And I will jump over this, it's a bit too technical, just to point out that for the first time we now have evidence that selection is supposed to end when you're post-reproductive. But because humans are cultural and grandmothers and grandfathers can increase the survival of their related young by talking to them, teaching them about where to hunt, what not to eat, what behavior not to display if they want to be respected. We have opened up old age for selection to happen in humans. There's other really interesting impacts, such as in hunter-gatherers, most fathers spend a lot of time with their babies. If you do that, testosterone goes down. So if a society decides that the fathers spend time with their babies, those young males between 20 and 30 at peak testosterone, at their most aggressive, actually get a break from testosterone poisoning because of face time with baby. And this is not the case in herding populations where the males are out herding the animals. Another example where now the baby, through its face, his or her face, is affecting the biology of dad. And it's all subject to behavior. So this is from a review that's several years old, where we try to summarize where in the human genome you see differences. And these differences range from copy number of genes, completely new genes, genes that have been turned off, pieces of DNA that have changed only in humans, not between chicken and chimpanzee, but only in humans, and places of where you express something, where it's not expressed in the apes, but expressed in humans. And as a summary of, ideally one day we'll have the complete story of not just many more fossils, but we know that bipedality is 6 million years old because we have the fossils. Pair bonding, there is some indication it could be as old as 4 million years based on the canine dimorphism. The only primates that have same size canine in males and females are all pair bonding. And it turns out some fossils that are 4 million years old have same size canine in males and females. The use of home base, we don't know how old that is. Manual dexterity, we know it's about 2 million years old. Music, no idea, but some people have argued music was the beginning of language, a very interesting idea. Fire, certainly 1 million years, but possibly as old as 2 million years. Projectile weapons, symbolism, based on scratched ostrich shells and beads. Language, it's embarrassing. We don't know how old language is. It could be more than 1 million years old, but it could be only 60,000 years old. A secret weapon of these new humans coming out of Africa. Theory of mind, this notion that you try to guess what other people are thinking about you and others. Clothing, we have some information, and shoes, trivial things like that. Without shoes, it's probably kind of hard to colonize the entire world. So the big open questions are, we still don't know. Why are we bipedal? How old is fire? Why did this brain continue to balloon even though it was killing babies and moms during childbirth? What was the trick to become symbolic? How old is language? And most importantly, why are we the only species that is trying to understand this? So if you're interested about that, I urge you to go to Carta, the webpage at UCSD. If you type in UC San Diego Carta, we have a collection there of 24 different domains, ranging from anatomy to development to dental biology, with about 700 topics. Each one of these topics is a thing where we think that humans need some explaining, because humans do and are different than the other great apes. And finally, the map to try to explain how we became humans involves comparing, inferring things about our last common ancestor, fossil data, archaeological data, the cultural environment, biological and physical, and the interactions. How do babies become adults? Who is around to shape that, and how do they interact among each other? We always compare that to other primates. And much more recently, we actually start using stem cells from great apes and humans, turn them into neurons, and have little brain organoids in a dish to study how neurons of an ape do things differently from neurons of a human. And, spoiler alarm, they do things extremely differently, even in a dish. Why bother? Is this important, or is it just an academic, interest? Well, examples are evolutionary medicine. It's now understood that growing up too clean, not eating enough dirt, is extremely dangerous. You will develop allergies. Nutrition, by understanding what we used to eat for 100,000 years, we're appreciating that diverse nutrition is really important. Altruism, there are ways in which human societies can promote being nice to each other as opposed to killing each other. Reproduction, the observation that older fathers are the biggest risk factor for autism is very new, based on de novo mutation rates. How are we to raise our young when we have working parents? Maybe there are ways we can learn how to raise our young based on how we evolved. And finally, very importantly, we suffer from an epidemic of violence, with guns or without guns, in this country especially with firearms. And understanding how different societies might come up with ways to stabilize against violence might be really important. So with that, I leave you, and I apologize for going over time. Thank you very much.